Alright, so last time we mentioned that Spain is facing a lot of problems with Texas. As we mentioned, the United States has just purchased Louisiana, and Americans immediately after this purchase are pouring in, a lot of them to take advantage of the fact that Louisiana has cotton growing land. And as we mentioned, there are some people in the United States who believe that Louisiana Purchase should have included Texas because of the claim that goes all the way back to Robert La Salle. He actually founded his colony in Texas, and so some people in the United States think that all this cotton land that should be as a part of the United States. So the person that's going to be having to deal with all these issues is a guy named Commandant General Nemesio Salcedo. So the deal with Salcedo is he was Commandant General of the internal provinces. So we talked about this a while back, but as an effort to better deal with the hostile American Indian groups of the northern frontier, Spain hadn't completely broken up New Spain, but basically what they did is they took the northern half of New Spain, including Texas, New Mexico, for a while California, and what they did was they put it in charge of a Commandant General, and they said to this Commandant General, you're in charge of organizing expeditions against Indians, you're in charge of dealing with the Comanches, dealing with the Apaches. You are basically the head guy in the northern part of New Spain. Now, he would have to be subordinate to the king. The Commandant General would have to speak with the Viceroy down in Mexico City every once in a while when they're getting funds. But for the most part, the Commandant General, you're the boss up here. And again, the Commandant General in the internal provinces, the main reason that they had been created was to deal with hostile Indian groups. So Nemesio Salcedo is going to take over as Commandant General in 1802. When he takes over, he's assuming that he's going to be having to deal with Indians as his primary responsibility. He learns right as he's coming into office that France has purchased Louisiana. He doesn't trust the French, as we'll talk about a little bit later, but he thinks that it might be a smart decision to provide a buffer to the United States. Well, almost immediately after taking over office, Salcedo learns that the United States has, in fact, purchased Louisiana, and you have this expansionist power right next door to you, right next door to Texas, where you only have 4,000 people. So Salcedo, all of a sudden, taking this job, thinking he's going to have to be, dealing with Comanches, Apaches, who, before he taken office, were pretty much under control. Instead of that, your primary responsibility is to keep these Americans out of this place where you only have 4,000 people. Well, Salcedo's going to come up with a number of solutions to deal with this new American threat. One of his solutions is just going to be to throw military into Texas. We need soldiers there. Now, it's not as simple as just throwing soldiers in Texas because, Salcedo's going to be dealing with limited funds. But what he'll do is he'll take some of these soldiers that have been over here in this area protecting from Apaches. Now the Apaches aren't as much of a threat. A lot of them are on those establecimiento reservations. So we can take some of these soldiers, and what I'm going to do is stick them in a new base right here, Trinidad de Salcedo. Basically, Salcedo will end up sticking a couple hundred soldiers there. Initially, it's going to be 400. At one point, it's going to grow up to 700 soldiers. So in case the Americans try to reinforce their claim to Texas, saying it was a part of Louisiana Purchase, I'll have some 400 to 700 soldiers here. He's also going to put a varying number of soldiers right here down on the border of the United States at this Atacasito. Now, just a couple soldiers down here. But again, the thought process is soldiers here to watch, to make sure the United States doesn't get aggressive. But there's only so much stuff that soldiers can do. Soldiers, you have to feed them. Again, Texas, there's no ports here. They have to get all their supplies from Veracruz. While Spain owned Louisiana, you could get supplies up from the Mississippi River, bring them up here, then bring them over this direction. Now you don't control Mississippi River anymore, and Spain has put a ban on trade with the United States, except for with some exceptions. You can no longer get goods here, and you can no longer ship goods down the Mississippi River. So getting civilians to this area, feeding your soldiers, is going to be incredibly difficult because supplies have to be brought from the more populated areas down here, or in the case of manufactured goods, weapons, and things like that for soldiers, you're going to have to get those across the ocean from Spain. It's going to have to go to Veracruz, and then 1,000 miles plus up here to get to Texas. So that's going to be difficult, okay? Well, so we need civilians up here. We need to get Texas's economy growing. Maybe we can have, if we have civilians here, we can get them producing food for soldiers so we don't have to import it from these more populous areas. Well, how are you going to get civilians in there? Well, what will draw civilians into this area? Again, this is a problem that Spain's been facing for a long time. You've pretty much converted any Indians that are going to convert. The Caddos, had difficulty converting them. You've already converted all the Coaltecans. Essentially, anybody who can get converted in this region is going to be converted. Apaches, you can maybe you have them on these reservations essentially, but that doesn't mean that they're going to fight for you. Again, Comanches, maybe your allies, but who says they're going to be allies against the United States? So missions aren't going to work. Well, what about civilians? How can we get civilians here? Well, the thought is going to come up, Texas has all this land that's good for growing cotton. Why don't we grow cotton here? The people in the United States are doing it. Problem with that is that the area down here south of Texas, this is not land that's used to be growing cash crops. So you don't have a lot of citizens within New Spain, within the internal provinces, that have experience growing cash crops like people of the American South do. In the British colonies, you had, and now the United States, you had people growing tobacco, rice, indigo, things like that. These crops don't grow well in these elevated areas down here, and nobody down here has experience growing this cotton, at least not at the scale you're going to see it over here in the U.S. South. And nobody down here, for the most part, has slaves. And the thought process at the time was that in order to properly grow cotton, you needed to use African slaves. Now there are, again, as we've talked about before, handful of African slaves in Mexico, but not nearly as many as you have over here in these colonies, these British colonies. So, if you want to have cotton up here, you don't have people with experience growing it. You don't have the slaves that at the time they saw were necessary as growing cotton, and you don't have the manufacturing up here that the United States is going to have. So what's going to happen in the U.S. South is people growing cotton, send it up here to the American Northeast where it gets manufactured. If you grow cotton up here, because there's no ports open, you're going to have to ship it all the way down to Veracruz, back to Spain to get manufactured. That's going to cost a lot of money. So the idea is batted around, maybe we can grow cotton, but there's not going to be a lot of people up here that are able to grow cotton. You will get a handful of civilians. Salcedo is going to convince a couple families to move here from northern New Spain up here to join the soldiers at Trinidad de Salcedo. You've got about, at this time, maybe 600 families at Nacogdoches. Again, as we talked about previously, this was Los Cadiz. After it was abandoned, a lot of the families moved back to East Texas. There are about 600 or so at this time, some farmers. Salcedo, by the way, will stick some soldiers over here in Nacogdoches, and you're going to have a handful of civilians move up there to Nacogdoches from New Spain, but not nearly the number you're going to need, okay? So, and Salcedo will manage to get a handful of people settled up here at San Marcos de Neve. So this is around the area that today's San Marcos, more or less. So you will have some civilians forming this other settlement. So Salcedo will manage to get a few people from New Spain to move to this area, but there's not a whole heck of a lot of incentive. No matter how much land you offer up here, it's not going to be, people aren't going to take it if they can't make money off of it. Well, what about bringing citizens from other areas? Well, there's going to be this big push for Salcedo to bring in families from Louisiana. You didn't have that many Spanish families settled in Louisiana while Spain controlled it. So as we mentioned, Spain controlled Louisiana from 1763 to 1800, end of the 7 Years' War to 1800. But they hadn't brought a lot of Spaniards into this area, not a lot of Spanish civilians, for a lot of the same reason they have problems bringing Spaniards to Texas. There are, however, a number of French families. So when the French controlled Louisiana, they brought a lot of people in. The French are Catholics, and a lot of these Catholics are going to be nervous when the mostly Protestant Americans come in, and they're going to be nervous about being under Protestant government. Maybe they're going to force me to give up my Catholicism. So you've got a lot of French over here that used to be under the rule of Spain, a lot of people of French ancestry that have been raised under Spanish government that want to continue to maintain a standard of Spanish government. So you're going to have these families start petitioning Salcedo to settle within Texas. We want to stay under Spain. We've grown used to being under a Spanish government. We are Catholics, and we want to stay under a Catholic government. So these Frenchmen will petition Salcedo, but for the most part, Salcedo will say, thank you, but no thank you. Salcedo does not trust the French. People of French ancestry, even though the French and the Spanish have been allies for on and off for the past 100 years after their families married in the same family, the way Salcedo sees the French is basically in the vein of the French Revolution. Even though Napoleon's taken power of France, he sees the French as revolutionaries. He's worried they're going to bring revolutionary ideas into the internal provinces, bring them into Texas, and just in general, he thinks the French, the French aren't to be trusted. The Spanish and the French have fought in the past, and so he's nervous about allowing these French to settle in Texas. He's going to make a couple exceptions. So in some French families, he'll allow to settle in Texas, but not nearly the number that a lot of people want him to. A lot of people look at this and say, you got to put aside your reservations because the Americans are moving in really quickly, but he's not going to be able to. What Salcedo will do is he is going to allow a handful of American deserters to settle in here in Texas. So U.S. Army is going to start coming in, setting up their own bases in Louisiana. A lot of people join the Army. They don't want to stay in it. They enlisted for a couple years. Well, they look over here, Spain, there's a lot of land available over here. Come up here, find a Spanish commander at Nacogdoches, and this guy calls up Salcedo and says, can this guy stay? A handful of these deserters will be allowed to stay, upping the population of Texas a little bit. You also actually see Salcedo approve of escaped slaves. So as Americans start coming in here, start bringing African slaves in, these slaves will escape into Spanish territory. The Spanish military will find them, or they'll make their way into Spanish settlements. And even though the Spanish have African slaves, not that many in Texas, and the way that Salcedo is going to view this is, that's any slave that escapes here to Texas is one less slave that these plantation owners have. That's one additional reason to hurt their economy, and it's one person that will up the population of Texas. So Salcedo will tell his commanders of Texas, go ahead and allow escaped slaves in here. So you'll see that deserters are going to come in, escaped slaves are going to come in. This actually almost causes a crisis at certain points because plantation owners want to get their slaves back, and actually we'll come and talk about that a little bit more. But populations built up a little bit by these groups, and you'll see Salcedo approve of this would be a group of escaped slaves making their way to Texas. Salcedo will also approve of non-French Europeans to settle Texas. This guy right here, his name is the Baron de Bastrop. He's from Holland. The Baron de Bastrop is actually Holland was invaded by Napoleon at some point. He fled, looking for a place to live, arrives in Texas, petitions Salcedo, can I settle here? And Salcedo will allow him. Salcedo will also allow a handful of Germans to settle in Texas, and in general, he doesn't have an issue except for with French and Americans settling in Texas. And actually, somebody proposes to Salcedo that we allow Americans to settle here, but he says no. At least he's going to say no, we don't want them. That will basically hand this area to the United States if we allow Americans to settle here, except for obviously deserters and escaped slaves. So handful of Europeans, people from New Spain, escaped slaves, deserters, couple French, but again, he made basically what he says is, if any French want to settle, they can't settle in Texas. It's too close to here. Maybe they can settle in the interior of Mexico a little bit. Well, what about American Indians. There's going to be this discussion of Mississippi culture groups possibly moving into Texas. So as Americans are expanding and started to take all this cotton land, they start encroaching upon a number of these Mississippi culture groups. For a long time, we mentioned at the very beginning that Mississippi culture groups, despite dying of disease, had a fairly high population in this area. Well, as American population is growing, as they start looking for cotton growing lands, you're going to have them start encroaching on these groups like the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and these guys are going to start having to deal with encroachment on their lands. And a number of these groups are going to say, well, these guys are just going to take our lands, we should just get out of here. And you'll start seeing some begin to petition the Spanish government for to be settled in Texas. And so that's actually going to be this smaller Mississippi culture group called the Alabama Coushatta's. So the Alabama Coushatta's, they're essentially two different tribes, but they're going to petition together to settle here in Texas. And again, we've talked about Mississippi culture groups before. This isn't like the Apaches and Comanches. They're not nomads. These are groups highly civilized, grow crops. By this point, from being exposed to Europeans, they have learned to speak multiple languages. A lot of them speak English, some speak Spanish, some speak French. And so these groups are going to petition Salcedo to settle in Texas. Well, in 1804, Salcedo, so this would be actually a picture of what a Mississippi culture group looks like by 1804. So in some ways, it's very similar to what you would see in a lot of Spanish settlements. You have, in San Antonio, a lot of people that are ethnically Indian, but they are European and they speak Spanish, live in European-style houses. Well, a lot of Mississippi culture groups, through contact with Europeans, they're still genetically Indian, but they have adopted European ways. So this is almost like adding a group similar to what you would see in San Antonio to Texas. Well, in 1804, Salcedo will approve a group of Alabama Coushatta's to settle in Texas, and we'll see them settle in East Texas over here. So building your population up a little bit. And by the way, of the three Indian reservations today in Texas, one is the Alabama Coushatta's, one is these Tiguas over here in El Paso. We're not going to talk about West Texas for a while, but the Alabama Coushatta's are still around. They arrived in 1804. They're still in the same area today. All right, so you've got all these groups. Again, not much settlement from New Spain itself, but you have a handful of Europeans, handful of French settlers, handful of deserters, slaves, Eastern Indians. Well, what about actually bringing people from Spain itself, from Europe, from Spain proper? There will be discussion in 1805 of doing exactly that. The Spanish king at the time, he's incredibly weak. Some people think from inbreeding or whatever, he may have mental issues, but he's actually not in control of Spain really at the time. It's this guy who's his prime minister, essentially. His name's Manuel Godoy. Godoy comes up with a plan in 1805 to encourage people from Spain to settle in Texas. Actually, he starts offering land, starts offering free passage to anyone in Spain who will settle in Texas. He's going to start this big propaganda campaign in Spain. Come over here, free land. Again, more people here. We slow down Americans. We prevent American expansion in this region. And he doesn't put that on the advertisements, but he will get 4,000 people to sign up. And the idea is going to be they're going to come over here, form some new towns. When they get in here, start growing food for soldiers, maybe build some industry in Texas, maybe start settling on these along the coast, establishing ports. And the guy he's going to place these groups under is going to be a guy named Pedro Grimm Arrest. So 4,000 people. And Grimm Arrest will be in charge of settling over here. And actually, Grimm Arrest is supposed to take over Texas operations from Salcedo. So Salcedo is supposed to step down in Texas. You deal with the western part of the internal provinces. Grimm Arrest will deal with Texas and the United States. And in order to help Grimm Arrest, an additional 1,000 Spanish soldiers will be sent with them. So we're going to have, again, supposed to be 5,000 people that are going to be coming here to Texas. And the Grimm Arrest and these 5,000 people, 4,000 settlers, 1,000 soldiers, they're actually prepared to come to Texas. But right at the last minute, there's going to be a war breakout. 1803, the French and the British go to war. This time, the Spanish are going to side with Napoleon. By siding with Napoleon, the Spanish now have to watch out for the British Navy. The British Navy, just as Grimm Arrest and the 5,000 settlers are waiting on the dock. It's not exactly them waiting on the dock, but I like to imagine they're sitting on the dock, their bags are packed, they're waiting for the Spanish ships to come in. They're going to learn, nope, the ships aren't coming. The British fleet has destroyed them because the French, British now at war, Spanish joined the French, British destroyed them. So Grimm Arrest and these 5,000 settlers that are being meant to buffer Spanish population are now sitting on the docks. They're not going to be coming. So Salcedo, sorry, you've got to find other ways to deal with things. So Salcedo gets a couple people in here, but the big thing he was hoping for, the 5,000 coming from Spain, it's simply not going to happen. They can't physically get over because the British have destroyed the ships that were supposed to bring them over. Well, what else options does Salcedo have? Well, he has this other option of continuing to... So I can only bring so many people in, Salcedo says, but what I can do is to help me better prepare for U.S. possibly claiming Texas, I can continue to pay off some Americans to provide me with information. So we briefly mentioned before that James Wilkinson was this guy in Kentucky who the Spanish had paid off to give them information and paid off to try to incite Kentucky to break off the United States. Now, Wilkinson had never gotten the people of Kentucky to break off from the U.S., but what he did do was provide the Spanish with information. Well, through these years, Spain had been paying him, receiving information from Wilkinson. Wilkinson, even though he's under Spain's employ, he had done a very good job of hiding this, and Wilkinson had actually also been making himself important to the United States government. He had joined the U.S. Army, become an officer in the U.S. Army, and he'd actually risen to the rank of general by 1803. Well, the new U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, will put him in charge of the United States Army, and he's going to place him as governor of this new Louisiana territory. So, U.S. buys Louisiana 1803. Jefferson's essentially going to place Wilkinson in charge of forces there in Louisiana. He's actually going to have two different duties. One is watching the army. At different times, he's going to be governor of Louisiana. But just know, he's essentially the most powerful American in Louisiana. Spain's employing him, and they're continuing to employ him. As a matter of fact, Wilkinson, we're about to get into him, but a lot of people call him the most deceptive character in North American history because he's a spy for Spain, and he's also America's leading general. And so what Salcedo will do through back channels is basically he's going to have Wilkinson provide him with information about the Americans. Are the Americans going to ever try to move on Texas to take it from Spain? Well, Wilkinson's going to keep him informed. So Wilkinson's in a very powerful position. The American president, Thomas Jefferson, trusts him, basically says, you're in charge of Louisiana, you're my governor there. He puts a lot of faith in him. And as Jefferson's agent, he's meant to secure U.S. control of Louisiana, meant to oversee U.S. expansion to Louisiana, provide the U.S. government with information they need about Louisiana. He's also, Jefferson's going to put him in charge of sending expeditions west to explore this new Louisiana territory and possibly explore Spanish territory in case a war becomes between Spain and the United States. We want as much information as possible. So think of this as Wilkinson's number one job, serving the United States. Again, born in the United States, speaks English, American, moved over to Kentucky, came under the spy of Spain, but his place of birth is at least the British colonies, and now the place he's a citizen of is the United States, and he's working directly for the American president. Again, his second job is going to be spy for Spain. Nemeseo Salcedo will be sending him money, asking him for information to provide on American forces there. So Wilkinson has got two very important employers, and two employers that are putting a lot of faith in him. He actually has a third employer soon after he arrives in this Louisiana territory. So 1803, 1804, Wilkinson gets out there. Jefferson, hey, explore this area, spy on Spain, protect the United States and Louisiana. Maybe I'm going to ask you to invade Spain. The Spanish, hey, give us information about the United States, help us find ways to buffer up Texas. Wilkinson's giving Spain information, giving Jefferson information. Well, he's also going to be serving a third master, and that's going to be this guy, Aaron Burr. So the United States, the way its political system worked is every 4 years they have an election for president, and in the 1800 election, Aaron Burr was running for vice president to Thomas Jefferson. So you would have a president. If that president, something happened to him, vice president would take over. But the way the United States Constitution was written is that whoever got the first number of votes became president, whoever got the second number of votes became vice president. Well, in this weird electoral college system, the way things worked out in 1800 is there happened to be a tie between Burr and Jefferson, and they had entered the contest working together, with Jefferson planning to get president, Burr becoming vice president. But Burr, upon the tie, goes to this House of Representatives to break the tie. Burr basically said, I would like to be president, sort of backstabbed Jefferson, tried to become president. Jefferson ended up winning anyway, and now he has Burr as his VP, a guy that doesn't necessarily like him. Well, Jefferson is not inviting him to cabinet meetings. He's not coming to the office or anything like that, because Jefferson looks at him as a backstabber. 1804, Burr actually shoots the former American Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. So there was some talk of him going to the opposition party. So Jefferson's a Republican, opposition party is the Federalists. Well, Hamilton belonged to the Federalists, was one of the founders of the Federalist Party. Now Burr kills him. So Burr has upset the Republicans, Jefferson's Republicans. He's also upset Hamilton's Federalists. So he's essentially a vice president with no future. Jefferson's not going to be running again with him in 1804. He doesn't have a party to go to. But some Americans like Burr. Burr actually thinks he's very popular west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, 1804, 1805, going into 1805, not on Jefferson's ticket. Jefferson gets reelected, but he's not going to have Burr on his ticket. So Burr's out of a job beginning of March 1805. So Burr's going to look around, what do I do now? Well, Burr doesn't want to give up on his political aspirations. He's going to look at a map of the West. Let me see if I can find a good map. He's going to look at this map right here, and he's basically going to say, well, Spain is really weak right here. They don't have a lot of people. Maybe I can engineer some way to take this area. And he's going to look, hey, this is Louisiana. The United States, all its government and soldiers are all the way over here. Possibly I could take this area as well. We don't know exactly what Burr's thinking, but basically we think that he's engineering a plan to use the fact that this area is distant from the United States to possibly take the new Louisiana Purchase from the United States, and using Spain's weakness to take Texas and possibly these other areas that are sparsely populated by Spain as well. So Burr out of a job, but maybe I can take over these areas. And he has this plot to create out of the internal provinces, and again, also he actually means to take the silver mines as well, take Western North America, and proclaim himself Emperor Aaron the First. Okay, well, Aaron Burr happens to be friends with James Wilkinson. So 1805, Burr will go to Wilkinson. They have a meeting. We don't know what's said at the meeting because all the papers will eventually be destroyed. But what we think Burr says to Wilkinson is, Jefferson trusts you. You're down here in Louisiana. What if you use your forces? So the American army is under you and Wilkinson. A lot of the army trusts Wilkinson more than they do Jefferson. What if you use your influence with the army to break away Louisiana from the United States. And he's actually going to say to Wilkinson, I think I can get together, Aaron Burr, can get together an army of Westerners that like me. Maybe we can take Louisiana, and you can use the U.S. Army to invade Texas, Spanish territory, and take that from Spain. So I'll take Louisiana, you take Spanish territory, and together we'll combine our forces. So we'll upset both Spain, we'll upset both the United States, but I think with your influence in the Army, in my militia that I'm going to put together from Western American settlers, we think we can take this region. So we think that is his plan. So try to find a good map here. So the actual plot would be Burr comes out here to this region. He finds some allies among these Western Americans, and then again the United States government's all the way over here. So we find a militia. I'll come down here. I'll take New Orleans. Burr has this sort of crazy plot to where the British might get on this, blockade New Orleans for them, prevent the United States from reaching its military here. Burr's militia will take the Mississippi, essentially taking this Louisiana area because most stuff in and out comes through the Mississippi. Wilkinson, maybe you invent a reason to fight with Spain. You come in here. We think the American army here in Louisiana will follow Wilkinson. We also think this army is more powerful than the Spanish army in Texas. You invade. You take this area from Spain. Once we take this region out here, we then proclaim this Aaron Burria or whatever, and I'll be Emperor Aaron the First, and Wilkinson, you'll be my second in command. So what is happening here is Wilkinson has three different masters essentially. He's got Burr that wants him to help him take over Western North America. He has Salcedo that wants him to spy for Spain. Salcedo knows that Wilkinson's working for Jefferson, doesn't know he's working for Burr, and then Wilkinson also has Jefferson. Jefferson's expecting Wilkinson to watch the Louisiana territory, protect it, watch Spain. Jefferson doesn't know Wilkinson's working for Salcedo or Burr. Burr knows that he's working for both of these guys. So again, Burr, maybe you can use your influence with Jefferson to undermine American efforts to put down this revolution. Maybe you can use efforts with Salcedo to undermine his efforts. Maybe tell him to station his soldiers in a certain area so we can take them easily. So going into 1806, Wilkinson has a number of different options. He could sit here, just do his job to Jefferson, protect this territory, ignore Burr, and just maintain this region. He could, hypothetically, while working for Jefferson, invade Spanish territory, take this area that the United States believes part of the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson would be happy with him for that, if he can win this war. So if you want to say work for Jefferson, just sit here or potentially get in a war with Spain and take this area for the United States. If he works for Salcedo, his job would be to sit here, keep the Spanish informed of what the United States is doing, and make sure the United States does not try to invade Texas, and if they do, feed Salcedo information that will help them defeat the United States during this invasion. Or Wilkinson can work for Burr. If he does, he could invent a reason to invade Spanish territory, or undermine the Spanish by giving them false information, let them start the war, then you move in here, you take this territory, and then maybe provide assistance to Burr's militia forces that are going to blockade this region, and you take over this whole large area. So going into 1806, Burr has a lot of options. Well, it's going to be kind of interesting because going into 1805, 1806, he's going to do something that is going to end up making these two guys trying to get the trust of basically both of these two. In 1805, he's going to dispatch two different groups of explorers. So 1804, Jefferson had sent these Lewis and Clark guys, these two explorers, to explore this area of the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson wanted to explore this area as well as get an idea of Spanish forces what the Spanish forces have in this region. So Wilkinson in 1805 is going to say to Jefferson, to make you happy, I'm going to send out 2 expeditions to explore this region. First is going to be under these guys, Freeman and Custis. You guys don't need to know much about these guys, but Freeman and Custis, they'll be the southern, essentially the southern version of Lewis and Clark, and their job is going to be to explore this Red River. You Freeman and Custis, you're scientists, you go down here, you explore the Red River, you find out what you can about Spain, what alliances with Indians in the area, find about animals, things like that, and you go out to the mouth of the end of the Red River. You come back, you provide us with information. Jefferson will be happy about that because he likes these scientists. He learns more about Spain. He learns more about the area of this Louisiana Purchase. But the interesting thing is Wilkinson will send this expedition off. Then he's immediately going to inform Salcedo that there's this expedition that's preparing to explore territory that Spain believes theirs. So what Salcedo is going to do is he will send out Spanish forces to intercept the Freeman and Custis expedition in July 1806. So what Wilkinson has done here is he's basically created a false crisis, but he's also endeared himself to both Jefferson and the Spanish. So he said to Jefferson, I tried to send these guys out, but the Spanish stopped them and arrested them. And he says to Spain, hey, listen, I helped you guys out by informing you of this expedition going into your territory. And so what we see here is he's basically doing something that helps those two, but he's also setting himself up to possibly help Burr, because now you have the situation where the Spanish are going to be nervous because it looks like the U.S. might be preparing to invade, and the U.S. is upset because the Spanish have arrested these Americans on what they think is their territory. Wilkinson will actually send out a second expedition under this guy named Zebulon Pike. He will set out also in 1806. We don't know if Wilkinson will rat out Zebulon Pike, but as we're going to see, he also is going to be exploring up here down the Red River, and also going to a couple rivers up here, and he also will be caught by the Spanish, but just hold off on that for a second. So just know July 1806, we just have this Freeman and Custis expedition that has just been captured, and the Spanish learn, eventually they're going to learn about Zebulon Pike. So Salcedo and the Spanish are nervous because it looks like the Americans are being aggressive. But again, they think Wilkinson is their friend, so they think that whatever he's going to be helping them out. So so we see Salcedo send the Spanish army right over here to this area that is between this Sabine River and there's something called the Arroyo Hondo. This region in particular is important because the United States believes this area right here is part of the Louisiana Purchase. The Spanish believe this area is part of Texas. This is where Los Adaes used to be. And so we have here this sort of standoff. Wilkinson is on the Louisiana side. The Spanish army is in this area that Spain thinks is theirs. And we have this face-off between these two armies. And this starts right after capturing Freeman and Custis, and we have this face-off. So Salcedo, he's nervous because he thinks American forces are superior to the Spanish forces, but he thinks Wilkinson's on his side. Burr, he's sitting here at this point. He's collecting his forces in the western half of the United States. He's preparing to go down the Mississippi River, take New Orleans. So he's looking at this situation. It's exactly what he wants, war between Spain and the United States. This will allow Wilkinson to invade Spanish territory and take that region while he takes New Orleans. Salcedo's looking at this saying, well, Wilkinson, we're paying him off. He's not going to let these guys invade Spanish territory. If he does, hopefully he'll provide us information to allow us to beat the United States. Jefferson looks at the situation and says, Wilkinson's under my employ. The Spanish have been hostile. They've arrested this Freeman and Custis expedition. I'm not sure what's going to happen here, whether Wilkinson prevents war or invades Spanish territory. Jefferson will be happy. So Wilkinson has a choice that's going to affect North America in 1806. He can, again, invade Spanish territory, then claim it in the name of Burr's new country. He can invade it, claim it in the name of the United States. He can keep getting money from Spain and prevent this war, making the Spanish happy and keeping their territory. So he has that as an option. He's got all the world under his fingertips. Well, what Wilkinson is going to decide to do in October 1806 is to essentially abandon Burr and find a solution that will appease both his two masters, and that Salcedo, Commandant General Salcedo, and President Thomas Jefferson. What he's going to do in October 1806 is he will essentially, instead of attacking the Spanish army, he is going to, actually, really quick, the Spanish will withdraw their forces very briefly past this neutral area to this side. Wilkinson is going to send an emissary here to the Spanish army, and he will say, all right, instead of invading you guys, we think this is our territory, you think this is your territory, why don't we agree to make this area between the Sabine and this Arroyo Hondo, why don't we agree to make this a neutral ground? So neither of us settle in this area, neither of us are going to station our army in this area. Let's have this be a neutral ground. So he prevents war with Spain. Spain's going to be happy with him. Salcedo will be happy with him because he prevents war, and this is a decent solution to this problem. Jefferson is going to be happy with him. Hey, he prevented war. Sure, we would have liked taking Texas, but this is a reasonable solution to this problem. But Wilkinson will make Jefferson happy, because what he's going to then do to Jefferson is he will send word about what Burr is up to. Now, he's not going to say that he's involved in any way, but basically he will tell Jefferson, I heard rumors that Burr is collecting forces in western or Kentucky area, Tennessee area. He's planning to take New Orleans, but don't worry about it. I prevented war with Spain, and I'm going to keep my forces here in New Orleans to prevent him from taking it. So Jefferson hears this. He's very happy with Wilkinson because he learns about Burr. Salcedo's very happy with Wilkinson because he prevented the United States from invading Texas. So Wilkinson's going to pay Burr a lot of money. Wilkinson a lot of money. He sends a lot of silver to him. Jefferson's going to end up promoting Wilkinson, making him into giving him a higher position. The government makes these two guys happy. Burr, I'm sure he's furious at Wilkinson, but he's not going to get a chance to be furious at Wilkinson because he'll be captured by Jefferson's forces, put on trial. He's actually not convicted of treason, but he's going to spend the rest of his life in Europe. So Burr's plan has failed. Wilkinson is going to be getting off scot-free, and he's getting money from the Spanish, and he's also going to be looked good by Thomas Jefferson. Well, there's one final little thing here from this little dispute that almost leads to war over this neutral ground, and that's going to be Zebulon Pike. Spanish learn about Pike. What they're going to do is they actually capture him in this area right outside of Santa Fe. They're going to bring him down to Chihuahua, where's the Commandant General Salcedo has made his headquarters. He'll speak with Salcedo. Salcedo tries to get to learn. Eventually, Salcedo learns about the Burr conspiracy, tries to learn more about it. Some people, actually even today, were unsure if Pike knew anything about this conspiracy, if Wilkinson just set him off not knowing about it. General consensus is that Pike was just sent off as an explorer, thought he was exploring for the U.S., but whatever the case, whether he was knew part of the Burr conspiracy or not, Spanish capture him, and he's going to be brought through this territory. It's really interesting. We've got all his journals. He writes about bullfights he sees. He goes through San Antonio, describes what he sees here, and then goes on his way out, stopped by Trinidad de Salcedo, goes to Nacogdoches, and then reaches the United States in 1807. This is a map, by the way. It's really interesting looking at this because you can see a lot of this stuff in Texas from it. So Salcedo has avoided this fight with the United States. Wilkinson's happy, Jefferson's somewhat happy, and both sides have agreed, although not officially, there's no official treaty, that essentially Texas it ends at the Sabine River, and they've kind of concluded that this neutral ground they'll figure out about it later. So by with Wilkinson's agreement, this neutral ground agreement, United States still kind of claims this region. Spain still claims this region. Neither's going to settle in this area, but they'll figure out later what's here. And Spanish are going to essentially acknowledge that the United States, the Louisiana Purchase extends somewhat up here. Maybe we'll figure out this region up here in a little while. But they have a somewhat stable agreement over where United States territory ends and where Spanish territory begins. All right, so Salcedo's managed to avoid war with the U.S., but he's still got this problem. How long is this going to last? And there's still some Americans, by the way, that in spite of Jefferson agreeing to this neutral ground agreement, in spite of the fact that both governments, even though they don't officially endorse it, they unofficially endorse it, there are still some Americans over here that look over at Texas, see these cotton lands, and think this is part of the Louisiana Purchase. We'll talk about these private citizens later, but Salcedo avoided one potential problem. Well, almost immediately he's going to face another problem right after this American problem. So things are somewhat settled here, but right after this, what's going to happen is there's going to be an issue in Spain with France. So in 1808, Spain and France, they're still at war with Britain. And you got Napoleon is going to start these Napoleonic Wars, and he's going to attempt to take over a good chunk of Europe. And essentially, in his war against Britain, he wants to rid Europe of British allies. Well, this is going to be important to Spain because by allying with France, you're now part of Napoleon's army. You're fighting off the British. Spain's going to have trouble getting across the ocean because again the British have this better navy than just about anybody, and so you're cut off from the sea. And France is going to go up to Spain in 1808. Hey, we're allies in this war. Goes up to the Spanish king and is going to say, can I have your permission to cross your territory because one of England's allies is Portugal. So Spain's France's ally, Portugal's Britain's ally. France wants to take Portugal. Spain does not have the army to take Portugal, so what Napoleon will ask the Spanish king is, can I cross my armies across Spain to take Portugal? Well, the French armies begin to cross Spain in 1808 to take Portugal. When they get over here, they're going to notice that Spain is not very well protected. They're going to notice that the Spanish king's not doing a very good job of ruling Spain. Again, probably has some mental issues, whatever. And Napoleon is going to make the decision, well, while I'm over here, why don't I just go ahead and take over Spain, make it essentially part of France? And what Napoleon will do is essentially absorb Spain into France. He's going to stick his brother, a guy named Joseph Bonaparte, as the king of Spain. So the king of Spain, the old king actually steps down, puts his son in charge of Spain, a guy named Ferdinand, but immediately after his son takes over, France takes over Madrid, puts the son in prison essentially in France, and then Joseph Bonaparte of France will claim to be the king of Spain, and again he's Napoleon's brother, essentially making Spain part of France. Well, Joseph Bonaparte, illegitimate, people of Spain are going to look at him. Napoleon hoped they'd said, all right, well, I'll accept this. People of Spain will not accept this, and what you're going to have is this huge revolution within Spain against French forces. This is a pretty popular painting of the time, but the Spanish start fighting the French forces in Spain. There's going to be this huge insurgency where the Spaniards are fighting off the occupying French armies, and they refuse to accept Joseph Bonaparte. Well, Napoleon's armies are incredibly powerful. What they're going to do is start defeating the insurgency. They're going to essentially drive the insurgency and all the people that are fighting against the French down here to the southern part of Spain, and all these insurgent leaders will take over this small area of Cadiz. And what they're going to do at that point is they will claim they are the true government of Spain. So you have Joseph Bonaparte up here that is going to claim he's the government of Spain, and you're going to have all these insurgent leaders saying, no, he's not the government. The true government is the king who's imprisoned in France. But until this guy gets put back in charge, we insurgent rulers are going to be the government. They set up something called a Cortes of Cadiz, which is a essentially a replacement government. Think about of sort of wealthy individuals. They're going to start this government until the king can take back over. Well, a lot of these individuals at Cadiz, a lot of them have read Enlightenment literature, a lot know about Republican government, and they're going to set up a fairly progressive form of government where they're going to talk about maybe giving some additional representation to individuals in Spain, and even representation to Spanish colonies in the Americas. So you have two governments here. Well, this is going to cause an issue in Mexico itself. Who are we supposed to listen to? Are we supposed to listen to Joseph Bonaparte? Are we supposed to listen to this Cortes of Cadiz? Well, a lot of people in Mexico in 1808 will say, well, forget both of them. Let's become independent and rule ourselves. And this in particular is going to be that criollos who are going to say, maybe this is our opportunity to break away from Spain like the Americans broke away from the British. And you'll have this huge, sort of discussion in New Spain about what we're going to do. And it's not just New Spain, it's all of the Spanish colonies. Should we listen to Spain? Should we, the Cortes of Cadiz, should we listen to Joseph Bonaparte? Should we form an independent government? So there's a huge discussion, 1808, about what to do. Well, a lot of Peninsulares, Spanish officials, they don't want this place to become independent because they want Spain to rule it once the king gets back, but they also don't want to listen to Joseph Bonaparte. So you're going to see a lot of Peninsulares push the idea of supporting the Cortes of Cadiz and until the king can return from France and take back over. But you have a lot of people up here calling for independence. But as we mentioned, in places, I should point out, in some places, they're going to almost immediately start fighting for independence. In places like Argentina, Chile, especially places where there's not a lot of Indian population, you don't have to worry about the race war that happened in Haiti. You'll see that people will start immediately fighting for independence. But in places like New Spain, where you have a large Indian population, Peru, where you have a large Indian population, what the thought is that we don't want to revolt because we're afraid the indigenous population will rise against us. So what these areas will do is support this Cortes of Cadiz. So all of this means that New Spain is in somewhat of chaos beginning in 1808. Don't know who to rule. Criollos don't know whether or not to go for independence. Again, indigenous population, mestizos, they're being oppressed by both the Peninsulares and Criollos. How are we going to get out of this situation? Well, Salcedo, he's going to be dealing with all these issues. He supports the Cortes of Cadiz, and he's going to be calling for he distrusts the Cortes of Cadiz a little bit because it was too progressive and liberal for him. He likes a monarchical form of government, but it's the best thing they've got until the king gets back. So he pushes the people of Texas and New Spain to support it for the time being. Well, a guy that's not going to want to support the Cortes of Cadiz, a guy that wants Mexico to be independent or New Spain to be independent, is it going to be the Spanish priest named Miguel Hidalgo. Hidalgo sees the situation in Spain, Joseph Bonaparte, Cadiz, and he's going to say, this is our opportunity to get independence. And Hidalgo is going to be in a unique position because he thinks that he can essentially unite the Criollos and the Indians of New Spain against the Peninsulares and use this war to get independence. So he thinks his position as priest allows him an opportunity that not a lot of others have. So Hidalgo, he was very enlightened, meaning they read a lot of enlightened literature. He even read some of the stuff talking poorly about religion, and he read a lot of political stuff, determined that New Spain, way he would put it, and it's going to be kind of interesting, he's going to say we need to get independent because we need to support the king. He's going to almost portray this as an independence movement against Bonaparte, and he's almost going to discount the fact that the Cadiz government exists. And what he's going to do in 1810 is he will, well, actually, hold off on that 1 second. Hidalgo, the reason he's going to be unique is because he'd gotten in trouble for reading this Enlightenment literature. He'd actually also got in trouble because he worked out of this, he's worked out of actually a couple different parishes, but he'd been pushing for indigenous rights. So he saw Indians being mistreated in New Spain, and he said this isn't right. He had tried to call for social reform to allow Indians to serve in government positions, things like that. This ended up getting him banished to a really small church in a place in Mexico called Dolores. And Hidalgo from Dolores is going to be, we need to give Indians more rights, and he wants major reform, and he sees the Peninsulares in New Spain as impeding this reform. So in 1810, he's going to come up with a plan to use the chaos of Europe to, again, this is going to be hard to explain, but we think he wants independence, but he's going to claim that he's fighting against the colonial government of New Spain, which he says is actually controlled by Joseph Bonaparte. That's not true. The government of New Spain proclaims for the Cadiz government, but Hidalgo will essentially ignore that fact, say that the government of New Spain is in control of Joseph Bonaparte. In 1810, he is going to basically say that here's his capital right here, Dolores, or this is where his church is. He's going to say that the people of Mexico City, the government down there, is controlled by Joseph Bonaparte, and I want the Indians of this region to rise up with me and join me in fighting the colonial government and getting rid of Napoleon's influence. Now, again, the colonial government would argue we're not really, we're not controlled by Joseph Bonaparte. We're declaring for this Cadiz, and we want the king back. But Hidalgo will say, they're not fighting for the king, they're lying. I'm the one that's fighting for the king's return. But in reality, we don't think he cares about the king. We think this is his way to get people to rally to him by saying the government's controlled by Napoleon. So in 1810, he's going to get up, September 16th, 1810, Hidalgo's going to get on top of his church, and he's going to call for revolution against the colonial government of New Spain, saying they work for Joseph Bonaparte. This is where you get this famous Grito de Dolores. Basically, he says, we need to get rights for indigenous people. We need to get rid of the colonial government. We need to reject Napoleon. And we're fighting in order to get help from the king. So he says, Viva Mexico. And so he's going to use the name Mexico, which is actually only the valley around Mexico City, but he essentially relabels New Spain as Mexico and calls for independence from the colonial government and loyalty to the Spanish king, which again is confusing, but he knows that a lot of people support the king, and so he portrays it as a revolution against Joseph Bonaparte. Well, Hidalgo gets a number of peasants who hear that he's talking about reform for Indians, and these Indians in this area, again, the majority of the population of New Spain is Indians and mestizos, begin forming this army around him, and eventually it's going to get to 100,000. Now, Hidalgo himself is a Criollo. He's an educated person born in New Spain, and so what he's hoping is that by being a Criollo and telling the Indians that are coming to his armies, don't harm Criollos, they're part of us with this. We're fighting against the colonial government, which is made up of these peninsulares, that this will unite Criollos and Indians. So he has this army. Criollos join it, a couple of them do, but the majority is going to be Indians, and he's going to march this Indian army through Mexico. Well, he's going to face a problem when he gets to this place, Guanajuato. So Guanajuato has a substantial Criollo population, but it also has a Peninsulare population. Well, Hidalgo gets into Guanajuato, and he knows the Peninsulares. This is the group we're fighting against. He's going to tell his Indian army, only attack Criollos. Only attack Peninsulares. Leave the Criollos alone. They're fighting with us for independence from this corrupt government. And so he's going to unleash his army on Guanajuato. But if you're an Indian, you see a person with white skin, European ancestry, even in the midst of a battle, you're not going to come out and say, were you born in Spain? Were you born in the Americas? And so we'll actually see the Indian Army and a lot of resentment build up, not just towards Peninsulares, but also Criollos. Both Criollos and Peninsulares had oppressed Indians. The Indians will end up attacking both Criollos and Peninsulares alike, and essentially anybody that is white will start being attacked by the Indians in Hidalgo's army. Hidalgo tries to prevent them and saying, hey, we need an alliance. This is against the Peninsulares. This is against those controlled by Joseph Bonaparte. But his army doesn't listen. And immediately after this, we're going to see Criollo support for Hidalgo immediately vanish. You start to see these worries that what had happened in Haiti will happen here. Again, except for instead of slaves, it'll be Indians. But it almost doesn't matter because Indians will continue to join Hidalgo's army, and they're going to march on Mexico to take over the colonial government. By this point, they get to 100,000. For whatever reason outside of Mexico City, Hidalgo will stop his army from attacking. Some people think it's because he's worried that the Indians will attack any white person in Mexico City, and he doesn't want that to happen. He doesn't want the capital to get destroyed. And so he halts his army. This is going to allow these Criollos, now they're going to join with Peninsulares because they're afraid that what happened to the Criollos in Guanajuato will happen with them. And a number of Criollos will end up joining the Peninsulares, and they're going to start fighting Hidalgo's army. As a matter of fact, Hidalgo's army will start having to retreat, and we'll see his army start losing numbers as he starts retreating. Well, as he's starting retreating, there's going to be outbreaks of pockets of revolution throughout the rest of New Spain. So as Hidalgo's having his success, actually before he really starts retreating, word will arrive up here in the north, including Texas, that there's a revolution brewing against the Peninsulares. In Texas, we'll see something called the De las Casas Revolt. This thing is not a major event in that all it's going to be is a militia captain, a guy named Juan Batista de las Casas. In January 1811, he hears about what's happening with Hidalgo. He wants to, basically he wants power here. Juan Batista de las Casas is a Criollo, and he doesn't think he's going to get power from the Peninsulares. They always hand government to Peninsulares, and he's a fairly enlightened individual. So what Juan Batista de las Casas thinks is, I can use this Hidalgo revolt to seize power here in San Antonio, place myself as governor of Texas. I'll get some support for this revolt, and I'll tell Hidalgo I'm doing this revolution for him. If Hidalgo wins in Mexico, he will make me governor of Texas and thank me for this regard. Well, De las Casas is going to march on the governor's palace in San Antonio, take over for the Spanish governor. He actually, at the time, the governor of San Antonio is Nemeseo Salcedo's nephew, Manuel Salcedo. He takes him prisoner, and he gets a number of supporters in the army in this area to join him. And there's not a heck of a lot of support for Peninsulares up here, simply because there's not very many Peninsulares in Texas. And so De las Casas, with almost no fighting, quickly takes over Texas. So De las Casas is sitting up here thinking, all right, things are going great. I took this over fairly bloodless De las Casas revolt, and he's sitting here as governor of Texas. Well, this would be somewhat of a meeting of people. Should we support Hidalgo? And by the way, these questions are going on throughout Mexico. People are saying, well, how's Hidalgo doing? Should we support him? Well, if we support him and we're Criollo, we might get attacked. But, if you don't support him, maybe you'll get attacked as well. But De las Casas proclaims for Hidalgo. Well, Hidalgo at this point is actually in retreat. He's going to start running away, and as his army gets lower and lower, it keeps decreasing in size. And by the way, Salcedo has learned about what's happened in Texas and to his nephew, but he's also facing revolts in other areas of the internal provinces, so he can't do anything about it. Well, Hidalgo, as he's retreating, he thinks, maybe, all right, my forces are starting to dwindle, but if I can make my way to the United States, I'm talking about a lot of Republican government, equal rights. Maybe the people in the United States will support me. Maybe they'll provide me with guns. And maybe I can sort of use Texas as a staging point to regain what I'm losing here. So beginning in 1811, Hidalgo starts retreating from the Peninsulari and some of the Criollos joining them. He starts retreating the north with the idea of escaping to Texas to get to the United States to get access to guns, things like that. Well, as he's retreating north, Salcedo's over here. Again, he's just heard about his nephew being arrested, and he hears that Salcedo's on his way up. I'm sorry, not Salcedo. Hidalgo's on his way up, and Nemesio Salcedo would decide to set a trap. People in this area have learned that Hidalgo is his forces are dwindling, and as a matter of fact, in Texas at the De las Casas revolt, almost soon after it took over, word arrives Hidalgo's armies are dwindling. He's in retreat. There's a counter revolt, and calling it a counter revolt is not even good because the first revolt is so small. All that basically happens in Texas is word arrives, Hidalgo, he's retreating, his revolution doesn't look like it's going to be successful. So you see some of the same officers that gave thumbs up to De las Casas' revolt, those guys will get together, start whispering with one another, and they will say, all right, Hidalgo doesn't look like he's going to be successful. I think that Peninsulares are going to win this thing. So what they do is they simply overthrow De las Casas, restore Texas to royal rule. It's very, again, they call it a revolt, but this is the main action that's going to happen in Texas during Hidalgo's revolt. De las Casas takes Texas over. Soldiers support him when he takes it over, but then when it looks like Hidalgo's not going to be successful, they take over De las Casas. So very, very simple takeover. Well, Hidalgo's heading north. Salcedo, he hears that these provinces are declaring for his side. Hidalgo, by the way, doesn't know yet that Texas has fallen back into royalist control, and so he continues to head in this direction. Well, Salcedo is going to decide to set a trap for Hidalgo at these wells of Bajan in this area right here, and he's going to, one of the forces that a guy named Ignacio Elizondo had defected and supported Hidalgo, but when he realized Hidalgo was starting to lose, went back to the Royalists. Hidalgo doesn't know Elizondo has gone back to the Royalists, so Elizondo will approach Hidalgo and say, hey, these wells of Bajan, this is a place where your army can refuel. I actually have some soldiers, we can support you, and we can help you through Texas. Elizondo, again, Hidalgo thinks he's on his side. By this point, he's really on the royalist side, I guess you would say. And so Hidalgo takes him on his offer. When he arrives at the wells of Bajan, Elizondo's forces, instead of joining Hidalgo, will join Salcedo's forces in capturing Hidalgo. Hidalgo and his main generals will then be brought to Chihuahua, where they're going to be brought before Nemesio Salcedo. Salcedo is going to have this trial, and it's actually a somewhat fair trial. Well, I guess Hidalgo, he doesn't really have a chance of getting out of this, but Salcedo will bring him up on charges of treason. He's going to determine that he's in revolt. Hidalgo will try to argue that he's revolting for the king, but Salcedo will say, no, the government of Mexico City is truly the government of the king. Salcedo will rule that Hidalgo has committed treason. He's going to have priests come in, strip Hidalgo of his priest rights, and then by this point Salcedo frees his nephew Manuel Salcedo, and he's going to have Manuel Salcedo and a firing squad shoot and kill Hidalgo. So Hidalgo will be killed. This is going to pretty much end the independence movement in New Spain, at least for the time being. And right after this, Salcedo will retire. But as we're going to talk about, this independence movement will not go away for very long, because we'll see it pop back up in 1812.